Welcome back, everyone, to another reaction video. Well, some of the most popular videos that we do on this channel have to do with top 10 lists, and many of those come from a channel, oddly enough, called TopTenz. And a while back, they did a video called Top 10 Misconceptions about World War II. I'll put a link down in the description so you can see my reaction to that video. As we kind of broke those down and talked a little bit more in depth about those. Well, they've got another one, 10 more misconceptions about World War II. So we're going to check that one out. The link is in the description to the original content. You can check it out without my commentary. Let's go ahead and dive into this one.
Welcome back to TopTenz. I'm your host, Cosmic Horror Madman Eric Malachite, and today we're talking about 10 common and stubborn misconceptions surrounding World War II. Today's script was provided by Gregory Myers, so if he's provided socials, they'll be linked alongside my own. And if you disagree with Mr. Myers at any point, feel free to rant about it in the comments. With that said, let's go ahead and get to it. World War II is the largest scale war in history, at least in any modern sense, and has filled our imaginations to the bursting point.
That's a great caveat he puts on that where he says in the modern sense, because in terms of percentage of the population who died, for example, not the worst war in history. There were civil wars in China that were far more devastating in terms of how many people were involved. It just wasn't on a world scale. And it wasn't as many people, because obviously by the 20th century there are a lot more people. And we tend to, in our collective memories, prioritize more recent events than we do ones that we've never heard about or that happened hundreds of years ago.
Countless documentaries, movies, video games, books, and pretty much everything else under the sun has been made regarding World War II, and it has become truly larger than life. However, like many larger-than-life things, legend and fact often end up conflated, and the truth can get muddled. In this list, we will be exploring 10 stubborn myths about World War II that just won't go away. One of the most enduring myths about World War II is that the United States sat out the war until, peaceful and kind, they were caught with their pants down at Pearl Harbor and decided to join up to help stop the Axis powers. Now, while it is true that Pearl Harbor was the catalyst that gave the United States Congress and Senate
Now, one of the things I have to say is that what's amazing about this event, this was a surprise attack, yet because of the presence we had with the Navy and the buildup that was happening and the press that were there, we have not only photographs while the attack is happening, there's also some very crude video footage, including of the explosion of the Arizona. And it's remarkable. It's one of the earliest events like that for which we actually have footage.
Guts to officially join. It's not like the Americans were sitting on their hands before that. To start with, Japan did not just attack the United States out of nowhere like a man getting mugged in a meadow, even if that's how history books make it sound. The fact is, the United States was engaged in a very ugly diplomatic war with Japan over its aggressive expansion, and war was almost inevitable. As for America's war against the other Axis powers, America had actually been helping the British for years and had ramped up that help over the previous year.
It's always, whenever people say the United States was neutral in either of the world wars, but especially World War II, we were militarily neutral in that we didn't have American-led forces in the field fighting. But economically, we were not neutral. We had been supplying the Allies. Obviously, as he's already mentioned, we knew war was probably coming with Japan. We just didn't know when or how.
This meant an attack from someone in the Axis was almost certainly coming soon, and with it, the official declarations of war.
And uniquely, the last time the U.S. declared war, we were talking about this the other day in one of the videos, the United States has only declared war for 5 of the wars we've been involved in. The War of 1812, the war with Mexico, the war with Spain, and the 2 world wars. That's it. No, they weren't
Many
close.
shocking World War II documentaries or other specials will go to great lengths to paint the Nazis as some kind of almost mythical beast. However, the truth is that they were human beings, but not only that, they were human beings who lost. We can theorize until the end of days about what might have happened if they won, but they did not, and were almost certainly never going to win the war. They overextended themselves from the very beginning, and the idea they were close to developing a nuclear weapon is simply not true. What is true is that they did succeed in making heavy water, but it really wasn't that much, and especially not for what they would have needed it for. This is also a terrible method for trying to make nuclear technology, as it just isn't efficient. It shows their nuclear ambition was really in its infancy compared to the United States. Some people will point to all the Nazi scientists the USA grabbed up after the war that were especially good at rocket technology, but they were needed for different things. The US didn't need help making atomic bombs. They had already slaughtered hundreds of thousands with just 2 of them.
So, yeah, all you need to do to understand how not close the Germans were to having a nuclear weapon is look at the amount of resources it took for the United States just to develop a couple of them in time for late 1945. The sheer manpower and money and resources and electricity and like tens of thousands of people and millions of man hours, the Nazis just did not have that available to them. They were stretched, as he said, stretched too thin. Their resources were already not enough for what they needed. They just didn't have what it took to be able to develop that. They never were going to. Maybe 1949, if everything else kind of settles down and they're not actively at war with the Soviet Union and the Western Allies, then maybe, but otherwise, no, not a chance. This one's
many people,
debatable.
When talking about the atomic bomb, will try to mention the bombings of the cities of Hiroshima and Nagasaki as a necessary evil. They will say that destroying 2 populated cities with hundreds of thousands of people living in them saved Japan from total destruction. The Japanese are talked about in this weird fashion as if they are some kind of alien hive mind that would have unreasonably fought to the last man. This makes it easier for the largest country in the world, in military terms at least, to sleep peacefully at night without being haunted by its past. However, this justification is nothing more than a bunch of hot air dreamed up by a country that doesn't want to feel guilty for annihilating hundreds of thousands when it wasn't needed at all. The fact of the matter is that the US had already bombed the living hell out of Japan, so the idea that bombing more of their cities would make them surrender is just silly. America firebombed Tokyo and bombed civilian cities all over Japan as part of a campaign to wear down the nation's spirit, and they kept fighting. Many scholars now believe the real reason Japan ended the war is simple. Stalin was about to enter the fray, and Japan did not want the Soviets as their conquerors, nor felt they could keep up with the war on 2 fronts.
All right, I'm going to push back a little bit on this one. I think he probably would have been okay, but he really just, I think, went a little too far with this one in terms of, the U.S. it's just revisionist history because we don't want to feel bad for dropping the atomic bombs. Let's go to the Emperor's words on this issue. So this is the broadcast that Emperor Hirohito made to the people announcing the surrender. Specifically announcing that they had agreed to the joint declaration, which is the one that was made by the Allies about this is what we require from you in order to end the war. So they were saying we accept that. It says, but the war has now lasted for nearly 4 years, despite the best that has been done by everyone, the gallant fighting of the military and the naval forces, the diligence and assiduity of our servants of the state, and the devoted service of our 100 million people. The war situation has developed not necessarily to Japan's advantage. Very diplomatic wording there. While the general trends of the world have all turned against her interests. So you could include in that the Soviet declaration of war, which I think absolutely played a role. in Japan's decision to surrender. It's certainly not the bombs alone. It's all of it. But then he says, moreover, the enemy has begun to employ a new and most cruel bomb, the power of which to do damage is indeed incalculable, taking the toll of many innocent lives. Should we continue to fight, not only would it result in an ultimate collapse and obliteration of the Japanese nation, but it would also lead to the total extinction of human civilization. He directly references the bomb as being a factor in all of this. So you can't just dismiss it and say it played no role whatsoever. It's just revisionist history by the Americans. No, Hirohito said it played a role. Was it the only factor? No, it wasn't. All the factors played a part, but it certainly was part of the reason.
Plenty of Americans like to think of World War II as the time the country truly united, and the whole world came together to fight off evil. World War II has certainly inspired countless fictional franchises, along with more documentaries than you can count. These stories tend to play up the idea that everyone was volunteering to go fight the bad guy.
Are we saying fictional franchises and then showing Band of Brothers? Listen, Band of Brothers is not perfect history, but it's about real people and real events, and more often than not, they get the real story right.
And unlike when politics usually divides people, everyone was completely in this thing together. However, the sad thing is that even the greatest world war of all time didn't actually bring America truly together. There were organizations in the United States that supported the Nazis, and while they were investigated for their un-American activities, the USA has a lot of freedom of speech, so people could get away with a lot as long as it was peaceful.
I think this is a matter of degrees, right? No, there's no scenario ever where everybody agrees, where everybody's united. But you get darn close at times. After September 11th, America was pretty dang united. George W. Bush had over a 90% approval rating. Over 90% for a president who had just come into office after a really contentious election that was pretty much evenly split throughout the country. That's pretty united. There's always those few. But listen, in a country of hundreds of millions of people, if you have tens of thousands who are opposed to something, or even 100,000 that are opposed to something, that doesn't mean you're not united. That just means there's always going to be that small group. I don't know about this.
It might then surprise you to find out that in the US, during World War II, there were marches in support of the Nazi Party.
That doesn't surprise me.
Some of them in...
There are a lot of idiots out there. I mean, no matter what it is, you're going to find people who support it. I think it's insane that something like the Klan exists. I can't wrap my mind around people doing that sort of thing. Honestly, I can't wrap my mind around hating a group of people based on something about that group, like their skin color. But there are people like that. And there are people who take it to an extreme to where they terrorize people that they don't like. So no, this doesn't surprise me. It's stupid, and these people are insane, but they do it.
Daylight. As for the US being the heroes who saved everyone, well, they almost weren't at all. Isolationists tried super hard to stop the country from getting into the war, and disapproved greatly of President Franklin Roosevelt's shadow war against the Axis powers.
And I got to give Roosevelt a ton of credit for this, because he knew his hands were tied in terms of actively entering the war, but he also didn't sit back and leave us unprepared for a war we would eventually probably end up in. The draft is instituted again, and we're building up and converting our civilian economy into more of a war economy. And so when the war is finally thrust upon us and the opportunity presents itself to get actively involved, we're not completely caught by surprise.
The isolationists in Congress thought the country could just sit things out, and they were not easy to convince. Some talk about the Blitzkrieg or Lightning War in awed voices, as if it was some special advancement in warfare or a genius trick used by Hitler and the Nazis. This misconception has helped create a mystique, and some still think if the Nazis had more equipment and the right bit of this and that, the sort of genius they had could have taken over the whole world. However, the truth is that the Blitzkrieg wasn't that clever. This war strategy was not exactly new, nor was it even invented by the Nazis. In fact, all it really means is that it is the opposite of trench warfare, in that you are trying to get a knockout blow on the enemy.
Yeah, Blitzkrieg is a concept that was used by stormtroopers in World War I, again, by the Germans specifically.
The Blitzkrieg is just the war equivalent of a sucker punch, a preemptive strike, which is just a dirty trick and not anything clever at all.
Dirty trick? It's not a dirty trick, it's war. That's what you do, is you look for an advantage, and punching through the enemy in an attack to exploit a weakness and get a breakthrough, that's not a dirty trick, that's just tactics. That's just war. And let's not take away from what they did, because it was brilliant. It was a surprise because of how it happened, especially when they did it to the French by taking their tanks through the Ardennes forest, because the French didn't think it could happen. So it was pretty novel and tactically surprising to them.
The Soviets found that this strategy was easily beaten by putting down multiple defensive lines to slow down the enemy. By doing this, they could take advantage of the fact
they did a dirty trick by using defense in depth. Ugh.
That the Blitzkrieg caused the Nazis to temporarily separate some of their lighter and heavier forces, leaving their flanks vulnerable. One of the favorite myths about World War II is that regular German citizens did nothing at all, and that if we just speak up in our own countries, we can make sure nothing like that ever happens again. And while it's a comfortable notion that people being responsible would have stopped it, things aren't always that easy. The Nazis started with propaganda and then followed it up by slowly ramping up terrible and abusive laws. People who spoke out against them to protect their neighbors were taken into camps themselves, and everyone was afraid. And we aren't saying that German people gave up once Hitler had solidified power either. Many German citizens did try to help those under threat from the Nazis to get to safety.
Yeah, I mean, but you look at what happened to him. People like Sophie Scholl, who was this hero, this heroine of a young woman who all they were doing was passing out leaflets, speaking out against the Nazis, and they were taken and beheaded in Munich for that. So yeah, I mean, were there people speaking up? Yes, absolutely. But again, I feel like this is one of those situations where we're looking at a small minority. Most people didn't speak up. And you can understand fear. You know, we all have that self-preservation nature within us where we're afraid of speaking up because of what might happen, and we see our neighbors hauled off because they spoke up. They take them off to Dachau and they're never seen again. It would have taken a mass movement by hundreds of thousands of Germans all at one time to have really made a difference.
Some German officials stuck out their necks, knowing the punishment for one of their kind would be terrible to get people to safety. Now, we aren't saying that there weren't some bad citizens as well, since some did report on their neighbors. But there were also many good people who did as much as they could.
And I feel like some of these are things where we're creating an idea that doesn't exist. I don't think anybody thinks that all Germans sat by quietly while this happened. I think everybody understands there were those who spoke up. There were the Dietrich Bonhoeffers and the Sophie Scholls of the world who spoke up and who did what they could. I just think that maybe we're arguing something that isn't there. I don't know.
It's arguable just how much control Germany had over France throughout the war, but some people are confused about how that control actually began. The Germans first occupied France about halfway through the year, in 1940. At first, they just had the northern and western portions of the country, and many felt that the Vichy government was a puppet state run by the Nazis. The French resistance began almost immediately, and it took the Nazis 2 more years to control the rest of France.
Yeah, and Philippe Pétain, who was one of the great heroes of the First World War for the French, is the one who kind of negotiates all of this for the Vichy government. And he's actually going to be found guilty of treason after the war and sentenced to death. And the only reason he wasn't executed is because of his frail health. So here was a guy who was a hero and turned into the villain because he collaborated with the Germans. The Germans understood they couldn't actively control every bit of territory they conquered in Europe.
And even when they had this, it wasn't like they had successfully conquered anything. You see, the French were a really hard people to take over, and they didn't take kindly to invaders on their land. The French resistance was so fierce that to say the Germans had the country would be a gigantic overstatement of their accomplishment.
And this is the most populous country that they've occupied out of all the countries in Europe, by far. So it's a massive task to control.
Without an incredibly expensive sustained occupation, it is unlikely Germany could have ever held the territory long term. With how strong the insurgency was, the Germans had about as much control over France as the United States had over Iraq. Keep calm and carry on has become, in many people's minds, the very perfect celebration of British stiff upper lippedness. It perfectly defines their people and shows how they managed to stay calm during the worst of World War II, by remembering to stay cool and go about their business no matter what. Or at least it would have been if they had ever actually needed to use this slogan during the war. The truth is that the slogan wasn't dredged up until decades later, and it has some interesting history behind it. By then, things were very, very frightening, and no one really knew what was going to happen. It was World War II, after all. The Nazis invading Britain, and at least temporarily occupying it, was a very real possibility, and something that the government had to be prepared for, even if it was unthinkable.
Yeah, so there's a perfect image you see there. The Tower of London on the left, you've got Tower Bridge on the right. All that smoke that's rising, that's basically the Whitechapel area of London where Jack the Ripper was doing his thing back in 1888. But yeah, I mean, if you go to the UK today and you go to southern England, you're going to see where they have very similar to what existed in Germany, where you have the Siegfried line with the tank, the tiger's teeth, dragon's teeth, I think they're called, sticking up like those tank obstacles. British had those too, to try and hold the line if the Germans invaded southern England.
The slogans and posters were printed up as part of a just-in-case shadow campaign to keep people's spirits up if the country were actually to be invaded. Of course, as we know, the British won the Battle of Britain, keeping any invasion at bay, and the campaign was never needed. But it serves as a stark reminder of just how close things were to very different and much darker outcomes.
And it's still true that the people of the UK had to keep calm and carry on. They were daily under bombardment and attacks and rockets that were landing and hitting civilian areas. The United States people have no idea what being in a war is like, because these two world wars weren't on our doorstep. They were across an ocean for the most part. We don't understand what it was like for people in these occupied countries or in these countries that were being bombed and attacked. Very different.
One of the favorite subjects of World War II documentaries is the fate of the Nazis, especially those who were not captured and put on trial at Nuremberg. They like to wax on about how some of them may have escaped to South America, and of course the infamous...
Not may have, some of them definitely did. I mean, we caught Eichmann there in the 60s.
Dr. Joseph Mengele is always mentioned. However, the favorite is Hitler, and the theories about him surviving somehow persist. Still, while the theories may stubbornly refuse to die, Hitler himself most definitely did. For starters, Allied intelligence told us he had gone to hide in his Führer bunker, and he was discovered with Eva Braun, the closest thing he had to a girlfriend. The Allied forces found...
She was his wife. His wife. Closest thing he had to a girlfriend. She was his wife. They got married the day before all of this went down.
The Fuhrer bunker stocked with supplies, which confirmed it was almost certainly his personal bunker. And it was also stocked with what was definitely Hitler's dead body. Now, some may...
Number one, nobody's denying he was in there. He was absolutely in there. So even the people who say he got out and made it to South America will say, yeah, he was in there. So I don't know what we're debating about whether or not he was in the bunker. We know he was in there. Yeah, he almost certainly, I'd say 90% he died there and that was his body. But to say definitely, a lot of questions about that. Definitely some questions about the body they say was Eva Braun. Definitely some questions about that one.
They argue that it could have been a body double, but the dental records were confirmed to be a match
By who?
with Hitler's.
By who?
At the time, there was no better way of identifying a body, and there was zero reason to believe it was anyone else but him in the bunker.
The FBI had questions. The FBI was, for years, investigating reports. They definitely were not convinced. I'm not saying it wasn't him. I'm just saying... let's not be so, oh yeah, absolutely 100% proven, no questions whatsoever. Yeah, he probably died in the bunker. Yeah, that was probably his body. Yeah, there's still some questions about it.
Now, we want to be clear that we are not trying to downplay the incredible heroism involved or the incredible amount of planning required to pull off the operation of D-Day. It was a miracle of planning, subterfuge, and so much heroism that will never be forgotten. However, despite all of that, the operation came closer to disaster than most people are aware of. The truth is that it was quite a defensible position, and a huge part of the Allies' victory relied on tricking Hitler, which had required months of careful work to ensure Hitler could believe that Normandy was not the main attack, and not even be sure of the day or the time of the real attack.
And even after the attack started, there were still some questions about whether it was the real attack.
While losing the battle and not taking the beach would not necessarily have lost the war, it would have been a giant setback for the Allies, and if Hitler hadn't been successfully fooled, it may not have succeeded at all.
Here's the main thing, and we talk about this all the time. D-Day did not change the outcome of the war. It changed the outcome of the peace after the war. That's what matters.
Several of Hitler's best commanders were not available on the day of the attack, and the intelligence operation the Allies had put together managed to make him think a bigger attack was still coming elsewhere. He resisted calls from his commanders to bring in more heavy artillery and tanks, which might have stopped the Allies from storming the beach. Well, I certainly hope you found this video.
Keep in mind, there were several beaches. There's 5 what we call beaches, right? Utah and Omaha, the American beaches, and you have Gold Sword and Juneau, where the British and the Canadians and others are landing. Free French, Polish, all sorts of other countries are involved with all of this. Most of those beaches, most of those areas, it was, I wouldn't say easy, but it wasn't like it was at, say, Omaha or at some of the other areas. But again, didn't change the outcome of the war, but it did change the outcome of the peace, which is what we were after at that point. So let me know your thoughts. Obviously, as the video went on, I found myself getting more and more antagonistic towards some of the things that were being said here. And I guess once you've already said 10 misconceptions, you go for 10 more. You're starting to dig a little deeper and you start to get a little more controversial territory. So found myself disagreeing with some of that. But if you disagree with me or with him, let me know in the comment section below and we can talk about that. Thanks for watching.